Hi, everyone, and welcome to our webinar. I'm Abram Kielsmeyer-Jones, and I'll be with you for the next hour or so as we move ahead into a new chapter in the Gospel of Mark, this series called Translation Notes. Today, Mark 13, 1 through 4. If you haven't been to this webinar before, just to give you a sense of what we're about, it's really two main ways of thinking about translation. One is at the lexical level. So what does this word mean? What does it mean in its context? What are my options for translation? And then, of course, because of the way that language works, we can't just do that at the word level. We need to do that at the clause level and the sentence level. And so we get into questions of grammar as well. We'll see today a couple of uses of the genitive absolute, and we'll talk through what that is, why that's important. These are the kinds of questions that come up when translating texts from one language to another. In particular, we are translating the Greek text of Mark into English. I do note here that the focus of this series is more on the Greek text and translation per se than on accordance features. Although we have many webinars available that address and unpack different accordance features, I'll just show you in the help files how to get there. If you go to the help menu right up at the top here, you will see a link to webinars, and that will take you to lots of recorded webinars on just about any feature you can imagine. So today, of course, will be in accordance the whole hour. Think of it as kind of an extended use case of how do you use accordance to help you translate a text. The handout that you see on the screen ought to be available in your handouts section in the GoToWebinar control panel. If you are watching this on a recording, or even if you're watching live, you can also get this handout and all the other ones from this series at a shared Google Drive folder that I've put there. That tiny URL redirects to that. Everything there is downloadable, and it has been there from the beginning of the session. I don't have any plans to move them from there, so you'll be able to access that at any time. tinyurl.com/Mark Translation Notes. Unless there are questions up at the top in terms of any housekeeping or getting your bearings, I think we'll dive in. I'm going to actually open up a new workspace, and I'm just going to get a Greek text open, and we'll go from there. So we've been in the Gospel of Mark, and we come at last to Mark 13, which, as you may know, has provided no lack of material for interpreters to try to make sense of. The question, one of the key questions of this whole chapter is when. And there is a when question already here in verse 4. I'm just going to preview this a little bit, where the four of the disciples ask, when will these things happen? We'll talk about what these things are, but I just want to note at the very outset, this when question, pate, it's four letters in Greek. It's one word, four letters in English, as it turns out. It has led to all kinds of different interpretations, and so we'll kind of address those as we go. But just thinking about this theologically, especially being in the Christian liturgical season of Advent, there is this observation of Christ's first coming and this looking ahead to his second coming. The question, of course, being when is that second coming? And so this passage is not necessarily about the second coming as such, but it is asking a similar when question as the chapter goes along. Now, whether the disciples mean to be asking about the end of time or not, we'll address that as we go. It's not clear to me that they are, but I do want to just set the stage that this one word, this when question that the disciples ask, and even the ambiguity in these things, I think that's kind of where this chapter moves from just an initial narrative and an observation about the temple into something much bigger that provides some challenges for interpretation and some different views. So all of that said, let's start with the easy part, which is Mark 13:1, and even 2 and 3 are not very difficult in terms of interpretation. Even the translation is not all that difficult with these verses. So we'll start with verse 1. Here it is in the handout, and let me get to accordance for this. And I will read just this first verse. I'll make this font nice and big here. All right. Kai ekporua menu autu ektu hieru lege auto haston matheton autu didaskale ide patapoi lithoi kai patapai oikadamai. Left to right, it's something like now, going out. So you've got ek poruamai, which you can see here in the instant details. You've got poruamai, I go, and the ek is out of, that prefix. So going out of, out to, that's him, Jesus. Talk about why that's in the genitive in just a moment. So you have something like, and as he was going out of, got that ek again there. I'm not sure that's needed with the ek here, but he's going out of the temple, says to him, one of the disciples, his. So one of his disciples says to him, that's often been called the historical present. The idea some interpreters have there is that it is meant to bring us closer to the world of the text, a sort of vividness, just like we might retell a past event in daily conversation using the present tense. So one of his disciples said to him, "Teacher, look or behold such stones and such buildings." All right, let's get to work on this verse. Here's a smoother, what I hope is a smoother translation. Mark 13:1. And by the way, there's a questions box you can use if you're here live. Any time you've got a question or comment, put it in there and I'll stop from time to time to check. Now, as Jesus was going out of the temple, one of his disciples said to him, "Teacher, look, what great stones and what great buildings." I follow the NET here, where Kai has been translated as now to indicate the transition to a new topic. Kai is a flexible word. You can always just in your initial translation put and, but I think it's often worth coming back to. This is not necessarily meant to tightly conjoin with what came before it. And if we want to just go up and look at that, I'll open up a parallel English pane. We had Jesus in the temple with the disciples and this widow, and now he's leaving there. So it's meant to be a new scene. He's going out of the temple. So I think now there makes sense. You can see here the NET's note. Kai has been translated as now. I put this in the handout to indicate the transition to a new topic. And this is a new topic. What we've got after that is ekporua menu autu. And if you remember your inflections, this OU, this omicron upsilon here, is genitive. In fact, it's masculine singular genitive, and it's here in the participle, and it's here in the pronoun. And the genitive case, autu, it would typically mean something like possession. In fact, here it does. Haston matheton autu, one of his disciples. So we might ask the question, what's this doing here in the genitive case? Well, this is what's called the genitive absolute. We have seen this in Mark before. Per Mounce, and I put this in the handout too, Mounce says a genitive absolute is a noun or pronoun, so that's autu, and a participle, that's ekporua menu, a noun or pronoun and a participle in the genitive that are not grammatically connected to the rest of the sentence. In other words, there will be no word elsewhere in the sentence that the participial phrase modifies. Now this is Mounce means this in a very specific and precise way, that it's not grammatically connected. It is, of course, logically connected to the rest of the sentence, and that's why I've translated it as Jesus was going out of the temple. That is setting the stage for what's going to happen next. But the verb lege needs, this is the main verb, it needs a subject in the nominative case. And autu is not nominative. It's genitive. So that does not go with this indicative verb. Something else must, and we find that with haste. That is the subject. You can see here in the instant details, masculine singular nominative. And that's modified by one of his disciples. That's the whole subject, but it's in the nominative case. The genitive here is just modifying or restricting or specifying what one we're talking about, one out of his group of disciples. So haste is the subject, it's in the nominative, it goes with lege. So in that sense, this genitive absolute is not grammatically connected to the rest of the sentence. That's what mounts means. It doesn't quite work how you might expect a participle to work. In other words, if you were just scanning this and you saw participle and main verb, you might expect this participle to go with this main verb lege, but it does not. Or you might expect something like, now as Jesus was going out of the temple, he said, but that is not the case here. It's a genitive absolute. And I specify here the subject of the genitive absolute, autou, Jesus, is not the subject of what follows, as I just pointed out. You can always decide, I've mentioned this often, that Greek is not as, what's the word I'm looking for? Frequent in its use of who is the one that's talking, especially in this gospel that's about Jesus. So you can always decide to add that back in, especially at the beginning of a chapter. I tend to favor that, just bringing out explicitly. But I put it in brackets. The text itself does not say Jesus, but there's not really any question. You'll see here in the NET, they'll note this, which is great. So if your goal is to stick as close to the Greek as possible, they will tell you when something like Jesus is not actually in the Greek text per se. The person is, the word Jesus is not. And so Jesu, Jesus is not here. The referent has been specified in the translation for clarity. That's one of the many minor decisions to make along the way. We'll come back to the genitive absolute in just a moment. Let me know if you've got questions about it. Let me also show you what the genitive absolute looks like in a sentence diagram. So you've got here, the way that these New Testament diagrams by accordance will do it is they will bracket it off like this to show you that it's grammatically not connected to the end of the sentence. In fact, sometimes you won't even have this connecting line here. And so this bracket is showing you this is a genitive absolute. You could take it out of the sentence would still make sense. But the main verb here is lege, and the main subject is haste, one of his disciples. So this genitive absolute gives us background information. We'll revisit it in verse 3 because there's another genitive absolute in verse 3. So we've got, as Jesus was going out of the temple, one of his disciples said to him or says to him, and then here's the content of the speech, didaskale, teacher, that's the vocative, he's addressing him. Ide, behold, look. This is an interjection, probably. Look is a verb, behold is more an interjection, although look kind of has some interjection qualities. Decker, this is not in accordance, but in his Baylor handbook on the Greek text, he notes that this word has verbal qualities. So you could keep this all as one sentence. You could say something like, teacher, look at these great stones and these great buildings. I've separated it into two sentences. I've kept ide as an interjection, but this is really just a matter of interpretation, and I don't think it's a crucial one personally. The idea here, regardless whether you take this more as an interjection or more as a verb with an object of the verb, the idea is, hey, Jesus, look at this, check this out. And I do think the interjection, I mean, there's if this is not a verb, that makes sense. Say, if you think about somebody who's amazed, they may not be speaking in complete grammatically precise sentences. So what great stones and what great buildings is exactly how someone might respond when overwhelmed by the greatness of something. Max and Mary, interestingly, that's also not in accordance, but it's a grammatical analysis of the Greek New Testament. They parse this, interestingly, ide, not as an interjection, but as an aorist imperative verb from horao. So in Max and Mary, this is a verb. If you look at accordance, you've got it here as an interjection. Look, pay attention, it's an exclamation. Let's see how do we have it here in the diagram. Let me get this so that it all fits. Yeah, it's just kind of hanging out here on its own as an interjection, and it's not explicitly grammatically connected to what the disciple wants him to look at. Now, I think, and again, I'm very open to being wrong here, lithoi and oikodamai are both in the nominative case, and you can see that by the endings. You've got the oi ending for masculine plural nominative, and you've got the I ending for feminine plural nominative, and that would not be expected if they were the object of something being seen. One might rather expect the accusative case in that instance. So because they are both in the nominative case, I think what we've got here is just a sort of disjointed, I think the interjection here followed by these almost kind of standing alone subjects. Again, I think that makes perfect sense with how somebody might react in amazement. You can see here in the grammatical or the Greek diagrams, and we'll pause here in just a minute for questions. There is an implied verb here, and the diagrams only put this in so that you've got completeness. So that you can see subject and verb together. So if you were to really flesh this out grammatically, it would be something implied like, so why are these in the nominative? Well, because it's something like stones, such great stones and such great buildings are here, esin ode. And that's what's implied in this grammatical analysis or this Greek diagram. So some options that you've got there, some decisions to make. Again, they're minor ones. I wouldn't personally spend a whole lot of time on ide, although you certainly could. This would be a good word to look up in BDAG. It will give you not just what the translation equivalents are, but look, even here they say properly it's in the imperative of adon, but stereotyped as a particle, and hence used when more than one person is addressed. So it's rather than just being a singular imperative, you could be saying it to multiple people, but the idea here is that it's sort of morphed away from being a verb as such. So there's more on that in BDAG. If there are questions or comments about that, I'd love to take them. Otherwise, I'm going to respond to these other questions and comments that folks have made. But this is a flexible word. I think maybe it's even somewhere in between an interjection and a verb. However, what I am certain of is that lithoi and oikodamai are both in the nominative case. So I'm not sure that we make those the objects of ide, but I also wouldn't fully object to that translation. Very briefly on this word, we can come back to this in a minute, but BDAG gives us for patapoi, sometimes the context calls for the sense of how great or how wonderful. This is going to show up in BDAG as an interrogative, but this certainly does not appear to be a question. In other words, we could look at BDAG and take this translation equivalent, which would give us something like, teacher, what kind of stones and what kind of buildings are these? But Jesus's reply, do you see these great buildings? They're all going to be destroyed. These stones are all going to be thrown down. That lets us know that the disciple is not asking a question about the architecture. What kind of material is this? What stone is that? This is not an interrogative as such. In fact, BDAG clarifies this here. Sometimes the context calls for the sense, how great, exclamation point, not question mark. How wonderful, exclamation point. And it lists Mark 13:1 as an example of this. So again, I've got this now. As Jesus was going out of the temple, one of his disciples said to him, "Teacher, look, what great stones and what great buildings." Or, "Teacher, behold." And if you wanted to get even more colloquial in your translation, this would depend on your translation methods and goals. You could even think of something more informal like, "Teacher, wow," or "Teacher, check it out." That is all, I think, relevant when ide is used. That great biblical word "behold" that may sound archaic, as the preacher Fleming Rutledge, the author Fleming Rutledge, says, but it's hard to find a good modern day equivalent for "behold." So you may wish to just keep "behold" in there rather than "look." All right, let's stop there. I see some questions and comments and I want to respond to them. We can circle back to anything else in this verse as well, but this is all day. Just keep in mind that there's not a whole lot of interpretive challenge yet. And so I think as much of a baseline set of facts or kind of certainties that we can establish early on in Mark 13, the more the better, because we're going to need them as we go through the chapter when this "when" question just gets increasingly challenging, I think, to understand. So let's go to questions, and if you've got one, type it in, and we'll get to you ASAP. All right, let me take these questions and I'll put them in the chat anonymously so that you can see them, but I'll also read them out loud. Somebody said, "What was the name of Decker's work that is not in accordance that you referenced?" That is Baylor, and I'll put this in the chat too, Handbook on the Greek Text, and he's got 2 volumes on Mark. This is from Mark 9 through 16, and that's all in the chat too if you want to copy and paste that. All right, somebody says in discourse, actually, let me put this in the chat first so you can see it and then I'll read it out loud. Somebody says in discourse analysis, many suggest that chi is used to connect equal thoughts, typically not to start a new subject. Does Mark use chi idiosyncratically, sometimes as a marker to start a new topic? Yeah, so Mark does, I don't know that it's idiosyncratic, certainly not for Mark. He uses chi in a lot of different ways. I think, the lexicons are great for translation, but they're also, especially BDAG, they can be good for understanding something like how a word functions and maybe even its history in some cases. So I would recommend BDAG for more on that. And in fact, probably your best source for a question like this is going to be Mark himself, but also any academic papers that you can find on chi. But it does list here as the first definition, it's a marker of connections. But as you scroll through this very long entry, we're going to get to number 2 in a minute here. Marker to indicate an additive relation that is not coordinate to connect clauses and sentences. Also likewise. So if we're thinking in terms of discourse analysis or, kind of asking the question of what's the author doing and how is the author doing it, it is not strictly connective in Mark all the time, or even automatically. I wouldn't even necessarily default to that, although maybe just as a scratch translation, put "and" down when you see chi, but do be willing to revisit it. So let me know if there's a follow-up to that or if I didn't answer your question, but thank you for asking that. That's great. Yeah, and the other question is why would Mark use chi at all and not just start with "ek porou amenu autou"? And that I cannot answer. I don't know, but that's a great question. All right, somebody says, yeah, this came up with the "behold." Excitement produces immediate interjections, urgency usually short. Look, see, yes, that's exactly right. Yeah, you think about almost like this breathless excitement. And so, yeah, I think that's very much what is happening here. I'll put this, another comment in the chat. Somebody says, an observation, not really translation. Disciples point out present wonder. Jesus points to future judgment, the bookend to the beginning fig tree judgment in Mark 11. Great, thank you. And we'll come back to that too. And I appreciate you going back to Mark 11, because I think as we understand Mark 13, we want to take it as a whole, and we want to take it in its broader context of what's going on with the temple and Jesus in Mark in general. So I think as we go through this chapter, I appreciate your mentioning Mark 11. We may want to go back to that. Let me know if there are any other comments or questions on verse 1. Yeah, I think all of these, I did just say this, and I'll just sort of leave this as, for further exploration if you're interested. When I saw that Max and Mary parsed this as an aorist imperative verb, and we saw that in BDAG, I did wonder, all right, well, could I actually find ide parsed that way in accordance, because it's not parsed that way here. And again, I think this may have to do with these words being in the nominative, but you can actually, here's how you run the search. You can just copy and paste it if you don't already know this search, but you can search your Greek New Testament for the verb horao when it occurs as a singular imperative verb. And here is the way that you spell out that command or that argument to put into your search. And I'll just, I actually got it run here from when I was preparing. So as we scroll through here, you can see like John 1:46, you've got it, come and see, erku kai ide. And in this case, yes, these have that same kind of excited interjective quality, if that's a word, but this erkamanai clearly being a verb, I think the idea of the parallel is to understand that as a verb as well. You've got ide hati, see that. So there are instances here where you've got ide, that same word, as a verb. And so that could be worth checking out. But again, I think at some point, I mean, personally, I already on this question have reached a point of, I'm just not sure. I'm pretty sure it's an interjection, not a verb per se. But the meaning, I think, is really what I want to make sure to get here, which is some level of being amazed and some exclamation points, need to go in my translation. But those I'm pretty clear on, and so we have that. All right, let's move on to verse 2 and keep questions and comments coming on verse 1 if you like. So Jesus now, introduced again by Kai, is going to respond. Let me get back to the Greek text here. Let me just clean up this workspace a little bit. I'm going to move these diagrams up and make this bigger. All right. So verse 2, Kai, here, we'll close these. Kai ha Jesus epenauto. And Jesus said to him, Blepes tautas tas megalas oika damas. Do you see these great buildings? Ume apethe hode lithas epilithon has ume kataluthe. And I'm going to try to go left to right. This is in your handout, but it's something like, very roughly, never will be left here stone upon stone, which will not ever be destroyed. And this actually, so I said today's translation is relatively easy. This part maybe not as much. So let's take a look at it. Kai here, I give the translation of but because it contrasts with what the disciple says. There's no reason not to also translate it and Jesus said to him, or so Jesus said to him. But I think something like but makes sense here. But Jesus said to him, because as we go on, and you almost have to translate the whole verse before you're sure of how this Kai works. Jesus is basically he's dialing down the excitement level. He's actually, you could say he's shattering it really, because he's saying what you see now and are so amazed at, it's all going to go. It's all going to be destroyed. I don't know if I've shared this story with you. This is apropos to this passage. I met somebody this was maybe 2 decades ago. I met somebody at a social gathering, and he introduced himself to me. And it was maybe 30 seconds into the conversation where he just looked at me and he said, It doesn't matter because it's all going to burn. And you know, he was like not an unsafe person. I mean, I don't have any reason to think he was going to do anything, but he just very quickly was pontificating about how it's, you know, nothing remains. And I've never forgotten that. A little more forward than typically we get with each other in our first minute of conversation, but it is that same sentiment here that Jesus is expressing, and not just a sentiment, but a prediction. Don't be so amazed at this, really. Do you see these great buildings? Surely not a single stone here will be left on top of one another. No part of it will not be destroyed. So this, again, if we're in the realm of excitement and in a higher register, so to speak, if the kind of emotional feel of the text is one of excitement and maybe even some happiness and maybe even expectation, maybe we're going to come back to this temple. Again, Jesus just brings it way, way down with this sobering prediction. And this is important, of course, for the rest of the chapter. So we're going to want to come back to, we will come back to this verse in the future. But let's start now with making sure we understand the Greek. And as always, I am grateful for your comments, whether questions or insights, and so welcome them at any time as we make sense of this together. This is the easy part of the verse. Blepes tautas tas megalas oikadamas. Do you see these great buildings? And we've got this fourfold as ending for the feminine plural accusative. So it's here, feminine plural accusative, here in the definite article, here in the adjective, and here in the noun. It's all feminine plural accusative. This is all the object of what is being seen. And then we move to the rest of the verse, and I've offered here three possible interlinear-ish translations so that we can see left to right what's going on before we think about how to render it. And I don't think this can be translated well left to right in a way that, I mean, this one can, you know, this clause can, but this one's a little more difficult. So it's something like this. Surely not will be left here. So ume, surely not, apethe, will be left, hode, here. Lithos epi lithon, stone upon stone. Surely not will be left here, stone upon stone. Has ume kataluthe, which will not be torn down. And I just add surely again in there because you've got this ume, this double, this emphatic negative here. The SIL Exegetical Summary Series gives it this way: there will not be left here a stone upon a stone that will not be thrown down. Now, this is, it may not sound like the most intelligible English sentence you've ever heard, but it's legible, it's grammatical. I mean, I think it would work. Again, some of this will just depend on what kind of a translation are you seeking to produce. This, I think, would be perfectly fine to leave it this way. There will not be left here a stone upon a stone that will not be thrown down. The NET translation note says that the Greek gives us not one stone will be left here on another, which will not be thrown down. I think, and you may not agree, and that's fine. I think this probably needs to be smoothed out in English translation. I'm not sure you need to keep the double negative as I have here. Although, again, if your goal is to preserve the Greek as tightly as possible, then I guess you do want to keep that. But double negatives in English can be confusing, and I think they're a little more natural in Greek. So the NET, for example, says all will be torn down. The NIV says everyone will be thrown down. Regardless of what you decide on this, whether you keep the double negative as I have in translation or whether you don't, I think whatever you do, you want to preserve the emphatic nature of Jesus's statement. We get ume twice. Once is already emphatic, ume. It's like never, never, ever. Twice is, I think, definitely emphatic. So he's, as high as the excitement is that the disciple, the unnamed disciple, expresses, Jesus is going just as intensely with the certainty of the fact that this will not remain, that it will be destroyed. Lithos, that be lithon, stone upon stone, just a beautiful poetic quality to it. That's what will not be left. And if you want to get really specific about this and maybe even really stay with this image, I think the idea is if there's not stone upon stone left, there's no stacking that remains. So it's only a single level of a stone. So if you think about ruins, you can imagine, the building has collapsed, but there might be 2 or 3 stones still holding together. Well, the building's still ruined because it's not what it used to be, but there's still some stones are sticking together. Jesus is saying even that's not going to happen. Not a single stone will be left on another, and that might even be how you translate it. That's kind of how I've tried to go. So I like preserving that if you can. I think the idiom there is, if you take it as an idiom, it's something more like it will be completely, totally destroyed. That would be a fine translation as well. But personally, I like to keep, again, as much as I can stick with the Greek, I will. And so stone upon stone, I think you can bring that over nicely into English in a way that both preserves what's happening in Greek and makes sense in English. So you might just play with this. You might, I tried a couple drafts before we got to what's in the handout here, but it is destroyed down to the last stone. That would be another good translation. Not even a residue. In other words, no stones combined together. NET does this nicely. I think not one stone will be left on another. So you've got multiple good translation options here. But the idea is, I think however you translate it, I see a twofold idea here. And I think it's important if there's a way to preserve this, or maybe even just bring it out in a study note or a discussion you're having with someone about this passage. I see here emphatic total demolition in outcome. So that's apethe, will not remain one stone on another. So that's kind of after it's happened, the aftermath. So total demolition in outcome and in process to even get to that point. Has ume kataluthe, and that has to do with the destroying of it, being thrown down, being cast down. We could look at that word in just a minute. But this, I think, and I don't know that I bring that out explicitly in translation, but as I reflect on this, it seems important that Jesus is saying both the outcome and the process, it's total destruction. So no stone left unturned, no stone left undestroyed, if you want to be poetic about it. Which makes me curious how Eugene Peterson translate this. We'll just look at that and then we'll stop and go to questions. Yeah, Peterson, as you may know, tends to be more fluid in his translations. You're impressed by this grandiose architecture. There's not a stone in the whole works that is not going to end up in a heap of rubble. Now that's interesting because this does speak to the process, but I would not, the heap is interesting because that does imply some kind of stacking. And again, not to push the image too far, but I mean, you get the picture of no stacking at all. But Peterson's speaking more to the outcome here, a heap of rubble. So just think about that. It's both the outcome and the process. This last verb here, let's look at it in BDAG, kataluo. And you'll recognize maybe the root luo. This is the verb that we use often for learning parts of how verbs are conjugated. And this kata seems to have like an intensifying effect to it. BDAG gives us to detach something in the demolition process, throw down, detach. So again, that's the idea of process. And then the pethe, the remain. Let me just make sure I've got that right. This is a word that can mean a lot of things. Number 4, yeah, leave standing. So that does have to do more with the outcome. But you may spend some time on this kataluo, but BDAG puts it right here under the first meaning to detach something in a demolition process, throw down, detach. All right. Let's stop again for comments or questions. We can only imagine what sort of reaction this might have produced. We don't have to imagine for long because we actually get the reaction in verse 3, but I do imagine some kind of shock to have gone from excitement to, yeah, it's all going to be destroyed. Just like I kind of felt that way when I met that guy at the party when he said it's all going to burn. Like, what? I was just telling you about my job. Like, what are you trying to say? So we'll get to the disciples' actual response in verse 3, but what comments or questions do you have on verse 2 here? And if there's any ideas that maybe I missed in terms of translating, especially this last clause, I'd love to hear them. Now, here's a great comment. Yeah, somebody says, sundown over the Temple Mount must have been intensely beautiful to disciples. Yeah, for sure. Here's another comment. Somebody says, apparently the disciples were speechless. 2 locations in Mark 13, 1 through 4. The group is going out of the temple, verse 1. Next location, Jesus is sitting, verse 3. Yeah. Yeah, we're gonna get 4 disciples named in just a minute here. There's no way to know that I'm aware of. There's no way to know who it was in verse 1 who asked him this. It just says one of his disciples. It could have been one of these disciples in verse 3, but it may not have been. And again, we could speculate, but we just don't know. We do shift scenes though, again, in verse 3. So let's move into that. If you've got, I don't want to rush us, but if you've got questions or comments about verse 2, type them in if you want while we move on, and I'll circle back. So let's go to verse 3. All right. Close the library. Okay, so we've got, and I'm going to open up the diagrams for this again because I want to see this genitive absolute with you. Kai kathe menu autu esta aras ton elion, katenanti tu hieru, eperota auton katidian, Petras, kai Iakobas, kai Ioannes, kai Andreas. Let's go left to right. And sitting he on the Mount of Olives, opposite the temple, he asked him, or someone asked him in private, kat idion, Peter and James and John and Andrew. Let me give you my translation and then we'll go back to the diagrams. Now, as Jesus was sitting on the Mount of Olives opposite the temple, Peter and John and James and Andrew asked him privately. So the word order just cannot be preserved perfectly here. And by now we're pretty well aware of that. So you've got the verb fronted here and the subjects afterwards. I don't know that I necessarily would make anything of that. But either way, in English, you would probably want to put the subjects first. I don't know how you could do otherwise. Now, as Jesus was sitting on the Mount of Olives opposite the temple, Peter and John and James and Andrew asked him privately. So we start with another genitive absolute. And everything I said about the other one is true here too. Kathe menu, autu, that same autu, it's the masculine singular genitive. And then here's the verb, the participle that goes with it. And look how it's bracketed again. The diagrams do that. Because it is not grammatically connected to the rest of the sentence. Eperota is a verb that goes with, it needs a nominative subject, not a genitive anything. And so the subject of who's asking is Peter and James and John and Andrew. More on that in a minute. But it's just like we had in verse 1 where we had lege, right? So and interestingly, it's also a disciple asking or saying, or not asking, but exclaiming. So same kind of thing. You have somebody else in this case asking, and you have a genitive absolute again describing Jesus. France says, this actually made me laugh, but he said, and I don't know if he was trying to be funny, but he said, as in verse 1, the genitive absolute is grammatically inappropriate since its subject is part of the main clause. But this is not uncommon in Mark. I think I believe, if anyone here is British, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think this is a sort of Britishism to say what Mounce said. Not that it's inappropriate in a like moral sense, of course, but it's how did Mounce say it? Not grammatically connected. Yeah. So France is saying the same thing. And just as verse 1 and 2, we had a setting. Now in verse 3, we have a setting. And I think that in this passage, interestingly, Mark is using the genitive absolute to locate where they are. So in verse 1, you had going out. That was genitive absolute. So the context there is Jesus and his disciples in transit. They're going out of the temple. I mean, you get the idea that they're having this conversation while they're walking. Now they're not walking anymore. You've got, I mean, Jesus is sitting. He is in a static context, and it's the genitive absolute that does that same work of putting Jesus somewhere. Well, it's not putting him there. He's putting himself there. But grammatically speaking, Mark is using that, interestingly, to locate them. France says something similar. He says the two genitive absolutes serve here to mark out the successive phases of Jesus's temple prophecy. First, the simple prediction as he leaves the area, and the more extended reflection on it as he sits on the hillside opposite. So this is going to set up the rest of the chapter. I mean, verses 1 and 2 do as well, but here's just some important context for the rest of the chapter. And I'll try to remember to bring us back to this with each part of chapter 13. But there's a question in verse 4 that's going to set up a long teaching of Jesus. Jesus will teach from verse 5. The whole rest of the chapter is Jesus. If you have a red letter Bible, it's all red letters after verse 4. And so the introduction to that is that Jesus is now sitting. He's opposite the temple. So presumably the temple is in view. And I think that and I mean in view, like, I think they're probably looking at it and reflecting on it as they have this conversation. I would imagine that's why Mark names the temple here, not just to be geographically precise, but I think as a rhetorical device. I think Mark is saying they have gone out of the temple, but the temple is still in view. Physically, literally, yes, but also it's in mind. They're thinking and talking about it. And that's why, and you've got this in brackets, but there's more that modifies the genitive absolute here. Where did he sit on the Mount of Olives? Where was that? Opposite the temple, which is going to still be a key subject that is at hand here. Kat idion is an idiom for privately or in private. And once again, we've got Jesus with his disciples, or some of them in this case. There's an aside where he is explaining. I'm trying to see where the last place that was. Well, it happens throughout Mark, that he kind of pulls his disciples aside and says something to them which is meant to be for them, and also we, the readers and the original readers and listeners, benefit from that. It's like a third-person omniscient narrator, and just like in theater, you might have an aside, like a monologue that explains something that the whole cast of characters in the drama may not be privy to, but the disciples are and we are. So when you see this kat idion, or even just Jesus and his disciples went apart or something like that, that's often how Mark is using it. I'm just curious here if we see this in Mark, how often it is. Yeah, all right, so here's kat idion. Privately, he explained everything to his own disciples. This is with the parables. They went away by themselves in a boat. Jesus took him aside privately. It's a healing story. Same thing with the transfiguration. Same thing here. So kat idion. So we've seen that before. That is an idiom for privately. The last comment I want to make before we stop for questions here is that this verb here, epeirota, it is third person singular. The subject, and you can see this visualized in the diagrams, but also just in the text, the subject is, so who did the epeirota? Well, Petros, Kai Iakobos, Kai Ioannis, Kai Andreas. So there is a compound subject that is either grammatically functioning as a collective singular, or, and I don't remember now where I saw this, but I saw in some commentary Peter as spokesperson, and that's why the singular. Let me see if I put a note. Yeah, oh, it was France, and it's in your handout. Sorry about that. The subject of the singular verb must be Peter, presumably as usual acting as spokesman. The other three disciples being appended as being also present to hear the reply. And he notes 136 that this happens again, and we could even look at that and see. Yeah, here you've got Kai Kate Diosen auton, and followed after him Simon, so Peter, and those with him. So this is plural, and it's those with him is conjoined to Simon with Kai, but you have a singular verb there again. So France is pointing that out as another instance of that. Let's stop there and see what questions or comments you've got on this verse. Yeah, here, so I'm just now seeing this question. I think it came in earlier. So somebody says, can four nominatives take a singular verb, or is something else intended? The four names would be parenthetical. No. Yeah, I think, I mean, if we follow France here, this is actually just such a great example because it lets us see a little bit more easily how this might work. Yeah, to the point of the question, it almost like a parenthetical, Simon and those with him. You could search, and it might take me a minute to construct this, but I believe there's a way in accordance to search and maybe this is a challenge for some of you, to search a compound subject, which is plural in number, with a singular verb. I know it happens with the neuter plural, and I think we just saw that recently too, where the neuter plural nominative will take a singular verb. That's a thing. I mean, there's a category for that. I mean, we just saw that recently. What I'm not as sure about is how much it's expected for that to happen with people. These are not neuter, these are not things, these are people. And I'd have to get back to you on if there's a way to search that. But I'm curious myself now, so I'll probably be looking at that later today. But there may be a way to search that specifically in accordance. I have to think that through a little bit. So in translation then, I guess, if you think it's only Peter asking, that would be hard to bring out in translation. I would not, to me, it feels like over translating, just say, Peter and John and James and Andrew were together and Peter spoke up as their spokesperson. I think just keeping it like this is the way to go, and just kind of, understanding that in Greek, there's a singular verb there. But whether it's Peter himself who asked him or all of them, they're all there. They're all in private. They're all the setting for what's going to follow. We'll spend a couple minutes here on verse 4, and then we'll wrap up. And I welcome comments and questions between now and then at the end as well. We'll leave some time. Apon humin, tell us, pate tauta estai, when these things will be, or when will these things be, kai tita semeon, and what the sign, and what will be the sign, hatan, when mele tauta sunte lesthai panta, what will be the sign when about to these things be fulfilled all. Again, left to right just doesn't work. So we end up with something like this. Tell us, they said. So this is either Peter as spokesperson or all of them. Tell us, when will these things happen, and what will be the sign all these things are about to be fulfilled? I might even have this say, and what will be the sign that all these things are about to be fulfilled? All right, so you've got estai as your verb here, and that is will be or will happen. Twice, Peter and the disciples, or Peter and the four, ask about tauta, these things. We always want to ask when we see a pronoun. In this case, we've got a demonstrative pronoun. We always want to ask, what is this referring to? What are these things? And tauta occurs twice. So the most immediate referent is the destruction of the temple in verses 1 and 2. All that's been said, and in fact, there's nothing really in verse 1 because Jesus isn't even talking. They are specifically responding to this. Do you see these great buildings? Total demolition in terms of process and outcome, if you want to sum it up. So when they say these things, it's something about this. I think this will point us, as we move on, to a larger set of interpretive issues in Mark 13. But for now, here's France again. He says the plural is presumably due to the recognition that the single event of the temple's destruction would not be accomplished in an instant, but must be an extended process. So, in other words, why didn't they say, and I don't want to get too nitpicky, but why didn't they say, tell us when will this happen, if this is the destruction of the temple? And I think this is worth paying attention to just because of what follows. So what are these things? And France is saying it's not just the destruction, but the things that lead up to it. And so to me, again, the best sense I can make of this is that if there's a this in verse 2, it's total demolition, but if it's these things, it's outcome, but also the process. And Jesus does speak to that. I think that's important, that we're not just talking about an endpoint, but we're talking about the actual being thrown down. And that may be these things that they're talking about, both the endpoint and the process, whatever that looks like. So to me, the more I read this, the more sense it makes that they would say, when will these things happen? Even though we might more expect that to refer to Jesus having just given a laundry list of things that are going to happen. He's really said one thing is going to happen in the sense that the temple will be destroyed, but he's done it in a way that's also at least alluded to the process that it's all going to be thrown down. And that's a verb, and that's a process, and that's a set of events. Presumably, this kind of opens us up now to the questions that will come up in Mark 13. You could also just read this, and you could do this in translation too, as a more colloquial way of saying, how will we know when all this is going to happen? Actually, I think that would be a great translation as well. Tell us, when will all this happen, and what will be the sign that all this is about to be fulfilled? I think tauta and panta would permit that translation. So to look ahead, the rest of the chapter through verse 37 has Jesus's response and extended teaching. We have not, in terms of time, hatan, so far, we have not gone beyond the destruction of the temple. We are in, I think, so far in this chapter, a proximate, I mean, we're within a century. We're looking ahead to the destruction of the temple in AD 70. So I mention that not to say that's how I think we should read the whole rest of the chapter, but that's as far as we've gotten that I can see in verses 1 through 4. In other words, I don't see any reason to think that the disciples are thinking about something like the end times or past 70. Whether Jesus is going to stay with them or not is another question. We have seen that Jesus is free. He feels free to answer people's questions as they're asked, and he feels free to answer the questions he thinks they should have asked. And when we get into verse 7, wars and rumors of wars, this is where interpreters start to say, well, yes, maybe this is just talking about the first century. Maybe it's also alluding to the future. Maybe it's one or the other. There's a whole book on this, and I'll find it before next time. I believe it's, I'm going to blank on the author's name, but InterVarsity Press published it. It's just a whole book on Mark 13. It's basically a commentary on a single chapter, and I'll find it and reference it in the future. But suffice it to say that there are lots of interpretations here. But so far, I want to kind of keep us with what's our baseline here. And at least as far as I can tell, they're asking in this proximate sense. Which doesn't mean Jesus is going to stay there, but that's where it starts. It starts with excitement, and I know we're at time here. Jesus curtails that excitement, shuts it right down, says it's going to all be destroyed, talks about the outcome, but also the process. And then you've got this aside where Peter and John and James and Andrew ask him privately, when will this happen and what will be the sign? So not just when will this happen, but the reason they want the sign, I think, is they want a heads up for this. I don't know that they're asking for proof. I think they're asking for a warning, or like they want, like a smoke detector for a fire. They want to have a heads up. So that's where we'll stop today. I'm happy to stay on for another minute or two for questions if you've got them. Let me end the recording first, though, and obviously you're always free to go if you need to. But let me end the recording, and then I'll stay on for just a couple more minutes. So if you are watching on a recording, again, this handout is right here at tinyurl.com/marktranslationnotes. My email address is here as well if you want to get in touch.